and Evan here with the Mileage Mafia, and today we're going to be talking about Evan's running progression. He's really made some great strides and recently ran an 18:34 5K at his local turkey trot. And I think Evan has a really cool story with running. He started out doing a lot of other sports before and came across running, and he really started to like it. Well, he came across triathlon, and now he's doing a run specific build for the Houston Half Marathon. So today I'm going to ask Evan about how he's progressed in his running. I think he's made some mistakes in the past, and I think he's done a really great job of learning from those mistakes. And I think they're mistakes that almost anyone and everyone can make. And he's really found a way to be consistent with his training that's helped him to take 2 to 3 minutes off his 5K. And even this most recent 5K was a whole minute progression, which is just a crazy thing to see and really shows the dedication and hard work that he's put into this. Today we're going to be, so what we have pulled up right now is Evan's running progression. And if you're running 0 miles right now, no need to fret because Evan did 0 miles. To be fair, this was shortly after a 70.3 Ironman. So he did have a lot of aerobic exercise going into that, but he took a week off and then an extra 3 days, did a 1 mile run, and then he really started to get going after that. So if you're starting out, we will learn from Evan about what he did.
Yeah, so a bit of a background before we get into this 0 mile week and onwards. You can see that I was averaging, you can see on the left hand side here, and we have only the runs pulled up. There were also some bikes and obviously swims in here. It was looking like about, 30 miles, 10 mile, 20 mile weeks, all kind of peaking around 30. Going into the race, I was in kind of the 20s. Then you can see, where am I? Oh, I went past it. You can see here's the race. And so during the race, I had some pain. It was kind of recurring issues I'd had before, but then you can see here, like Lakeland mentioned, I took a full week off, no running, no swimming, no biking, nothing whatsoever after the race. And then, yeah, I decided I wanted to build up smart. So started with just a 1 mile run and kind of went from there. So we wanted to have a different graph pulled up where you could kind of see it increase over time, but I think just scrolling up on this one should be sufficient to kind of see the way that mileage was added.
Yeah, so I think, Evan, one of the things you told me is that when you had tried running in the past, you maybe jumped in to a little bit too high of mileage and felt some aches and pains doing that. I kind of warn people that it's not usually going to be the first or second week that you do it, but probably later on in the buildup of fatigue. Do you want to talk about some of the times that you built up before this current build that you are doing now?
Yeah, so again, I wish we had the other graph pulled up and I could kind of demonstrate those. But typically, I would try and follow a build where every week or maybe every other week you increase by 5 to maybe 7 miles. And so within a matter of 8 weeks, you get to a pretty high mileage. And so I would do that, trying to build up from a small base of maybe 5 to 10 miles a week. And I would kind of try and decide I wanted to build mileage. And then over the course of the next few weeks, I would build up to 35, 40, 45, and inevitably I would get some kind of injury. For me, frequently it's my knee or my Achilles. Different people have different predispositions to injury, so overall I would attribute most of those injuries and kind of setbacks to building up mileage too quickly, as during this present build I have experienced none of those issues. And like I'm sure we'll get into, I've been doing a much more patient and slowly progressive build that's gotten me to my highest mileage ever for these last few weeks.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really inspiring about Evan's story is him taking a really long term approach. When you feel motivated to run, it can be really easy to be like, I'm going to go hit my peak mileage this week really early on because you're feeling good. But he's really done a great job of starting slow, or starting at a lower mileage and running at a pace that's comfortable for him and finding what that is. Um, so I think that that's just one of the huge takeaways that we have as we dive into this is you may not be where you want to be the first week, But even if you're running 1 mile that week, it's probably more than the zero before if you're starting from scratch. And if you have ran in the past at a higher mileage, we may say that you can progress at the 5 to 10 miles until you get to a little bit higher or something that your body's done in the past. Evan came from some weightlifting in the past, some other sports if he wants to talk about those, but had not done a high impact endurance sport before he got into running, I think. So,
Yeah, and I mean, I think with building up mileage, yeah, your kind of your training history, different sports other than running can obviously also play a role. But I think the biggest thing and the lesson I've learned that you can kind of see me learning to apply throughout the progression of this graph here is just that consistency is key, that hitting every run, or at least trying to hit as close as you can to every run, is really the key. And seemingly small changes, seemingly very attainable, easy steps on a week to week, or in my case, month to month basis over the course of, I was just counting up the months here on the right sidebar. The race was in April, so it's been going on maybe 9 months of doing this progression, and already just in that time, which might sound like a long time, but in the grand scheme of things, it's felt pretty quick. And I've already gotten up to, like I mentioned, more miles than I've ever run per week in the past, and I've done so in a way where each step along the way felt very manageable, but they've kind of added up in a cool way to something more significant.
yeah, really, it's compounded his mileage, and his results are showing that as well. So let's get started with it. We had the rest. We had a 1 mile week, um, and then we jumped to a 3 mile week, a 7 mile week, and this is all pretty easy. I mean, you're not going to get hurt going from. Hopefully, you don't get hurt going from 3 to 7, um, and then you can just talk about each week if you want to and how you picked the amount that you were doing, or was it just kind of on days you felt good you were gonna go and jog some?
Yeah, I mean the first week, the 1 mile run was really more of a statement than anything else. I think I had gotten a little caught up in trying to make my runs longer and harder, and coming off that previous run block that I'd done for the 70.3, I kind of maybe felt that I needed longer runs. So the 1 mile run, especially after kind of the injury that I sustained during the race, it was sort of just a reminder to myself to, or more of a commitment that I was going to be building really slowly and really carefully. So for this entire week, just the 1 mile run. There might have been some swims and stuff in here as well, but really on the running front, it was the 1 mile. The following week, you can see here, I did a 3 mile. These were really kind of as tolerated for my foot and my knee, both of which were hurting after the race. I was kind of on the treadmill for all of these runs, nursing those back to health. And you can see here by the fourth week in, I did a 10 mile week, which was something I had been doing for a few months prior, average. But here you can see my little, it was so over, but now we're so back run. This was kind of the 6 mile run. This was a big step for me. And then, you can see I've got a little starter long run here. And so there wasn't a really set progression. It was really just kind of as I felt, but making sure to stay well within myself and do jumps that I knew I could handle. There wasn't a ton of cycling going on here, so my legs were recovering relatively well. You can see I went from 7 to 10 to 18, 24, 30. So these were some pretty big jumps here. But what ended up happening was that at 33, you can see things get really uniform. And this was when I implemented my mileage building strategy that I've kept with all the way through these last 8 months without actually missing a single day. So it gets really, really standardized here. And
Yeah.
yeah, so Lakeland can maybe ask some more questions here, but this is really where my system starts to get put into
Mhm.
place.
Yeah. So I think one thing to notice about Evan's build is that he did have the previous weeks of doing 30. So he does progress by more than 5 miles in getting his way to 30. But you can start a lot, like if right now you can only do 1 mile, like this should kind of be hope of what you can slowly do. But if you do 3 or 4 1 mile runs in a week, that's four. The next week, add another mile to those runs. I think you'll be surprised at how well you can pick up an aerobic base. Um, and Evan came up with this fun formula. Maybe it's not so fun for some people who maybe struggle with being disciplined, but it's a really disciplined formula. He would do 4 weeks at a time, and I'll let him tell you guys that formula.
Yeah, so like Lakeland was mentioning, the 30 miles, I wanted to build pretty quickly, you can see, to a mileage that I knew I could handle. I had done 30 before comfortably with no problems. So I would say that this starting point, what for me was 30 miles, maybe for you it's higher, maybe it's lower. Although if you use the system to build to 30 miles, then your progression thereafter could look pretty similar. So maybe this is 20 for you, maybe this is 10, whatever it is. I think once you get to a very tolerable but still somewhat significant load, which is kind of what 30 represents for me, that's the point at which you can start taking very calculated, careful steps. And that's really where I think, with just a surprisingly short amount of time spent with that system, you can get some pretty good results. So the system I came up with was, I had always heard the 10% rule, which is never add more than 10% of your weekly mileage week over week in order to avoid injury. But I had done that before and I had gotten injured doing that. And it really accelerates pretty quickly when you're adding 10% week after week. So I always struggled with which weeks do I add 10%? Can I add, maybe a little less than 10% every week? But I mean, Lakeland might not have mentioned it. I started running really in 2021, 2022. That was the first year I started doing triathlons and running training. And so it had been a few years of injury setbacks. So I kind of committed myself to taking a much slower approach and figured that a few years on, even if the approach felt slow at first, I'd still probably be in a better place than I would otherwise. So what I did was I took my starting mileage and I applied the 10% rule, but instead of every week, I just applied it every month. So you can see the first month I created this formula every, kind of alternating 6 and 5 mile runs. There was no long run. This felt very manageable for me and it represented a 10% increase rounded to the nearest whole number from the prior month. And then I kept that up for 4 weeks. You can see here a little 0.01 deficit on that week. But then the fall,
Strava robbery.
yeah, Strava robbery, classic. But then 33 went to 36 for an entire additional month. And one thing I did was I kept all my run distances the same as well, which is something you can do definitely if it helps you with your compliance and with kind of getting into your routine, sticking with stuff. You can see I wasn't missing any runs. If you have a more variable schedule, maybe you just fit in runs wherever you can. I took Mondays as my rest day. That's more or less still true, as we're going to see as we keep scrolling. But yeah, other than that, it's really these highly uniform blocks of training that I do every month. And you can see I went from 36 to 40, and then we just keep progressing from there.
Yeah, some really good stuff. So one thing I think is probably worth adding is that a full month is kind of on the longer side, um, because the 10% rule, like Evan said, is usually for a week. So maybe you can modify that to what you think is best. It doesn't have to be 10%. Maybe you want to do 5% every 2 weeks or 5% every week, until you, if you're getting back to somewhere that you've been before. But I do think that you really can benefit a lot if you're giving your body the time, like Evan did, to adapt to this higher volume.
Yeah, and it can feel very repetitive, like when you're doing weeks like this, especially when it's territory you've already been through. But when it's truly unexplored for you, like for example, the highest I had ever sustained was like 45, 50, and that was only for a few weeks at a time before some injury. So once I got up there, I kind of knew that even if it feels a little bit slow, even if it feels like I'm only adding a few more miles, I can handle more. I knew that if I could just sit tight for a few more months of tedious training, then I would start to get kind of into that unexplored territory, start to get some PRs. So I kind of had to get creative. Like you can see here, I wanted to increase my long run for this half marathon training block I'm getting ready for, or I guess in the middle of right now. And so what I did was I took my Sunday run and I slowly added a mile away from it and into the long run. So on the graph, this is actually kind of a nice effect. As it goes up, you can see that this run is shrinking all the way down into a little 2 mile Memorial Park shuffle. But then the following week, I restored it back. And some days, you can see like this week, I had to split the long run. So there is definitely some adjustment that you have to make for kind of unforeseen circumstances for whatever reason. But overall, trying to keep a schedule, I think same runs on the same days of the week definitely, for me at least, helps a lot with consistency.
Yeah. And consistency is really the name of the game. It's all about stacking weeks. I think a lot of the times younger runners think, oh, I need to run high volume to really see me get good fast. But if you're increasing your volume so much that you're hurt, the high volume doesn't do you any good. It's better to do a more manageable amount like Evan did and to be reasonable with yourself and where you're at, and you kind of generally have a good idea of if something is conservative or not based on what you've done in the past, I think. So it can be a really tough thing to be patient, but I do believe that it helps pay off in the long run, as you've seen with Evan's story.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I kind of see this as I'm only just towards the beginning of this process because I'm just now starting to reap the benefits in terms of I only just broke my 5K PR like Lakeland alluded to. It was by just about exactly a minute from 1935 down to 1834, and I trained right through that. So that was in the midst of some training fatigue. So I anticipate that if I can keep up the training, keep the consistency, then more results like that will come. And yeah, it's really there will be a few months during which you need to kind of just tough out volume that may feel like it's a little bit too easy and just trust that with time, obviously. And yeah, the compounding growth, it's going to get pretty significant pretty fast. Like I tracked it out. If I were to keep doing this method, then I think I'd be doing like over 100 miles a week in May or something like that. So obviously I'm going to have to taper it off before then. But in terms of getting up there in mileage, and it doesn't have to be the 10% every month rule. Like Lakeland mentioned, you could do whatever works for you, but will get you a conservative amount of growth in mileage while still being able to keep in some intensity, introduce some specificity if you have a race coming up, and overall just avoid injury. It's better to undertrain by a little or even undertrain by a lot than it is to overtrain by a little and risk having to start the build all over again. So if you can just stack weeks like this, then in my personal experience, this has caused me to feel some of the more significant improvement than I've had, even with training programs that maybe felt more intense, but weren't something that I was able to sustain long term.
Yeah, and so if you keep going up, you can see that Evans hit 58 miles in the most recent week. And just to think about how far he's come, he was struggling to do 30 or 40, right, without getting hurt some
Yeah,
before.
yeah, and some of that was other lessons I've learned about injury prevention for myself, but definitely I think the mileage was the biggest one. And you can actually see today is Sunday, and I have a 7 mile run left to finish off my mileage for the week. This is my second week at 58, so two more, and I'll be headed to 64, which will be the first time ever I've been in the 60s. So very excited for that.
Yeah, that's some serious mileage. We're getting into the 10 a day average range, so really excited to see this progression keep going. And even in training, being this consistent, Evan and I did a long run a couple weeks ago, and it was really not far off his half marathon PR. And he was talking to me the whole time through it. And it really is a sport where if you take a growth mindset and you put in the work, you are going to see the results. So if that's one thing that you can learn from this video is just that slow consistency is how you win in this game, and the winning is just getting better.
Yeah, and just logging those miles, kind of the classic metaphor of stacking bricks, I think, and experimenting with what works for you and what allows you to, almost think of it as not how much mileage can I build up to at my peak, but how can I maximize over the course of weeks, months, maybe even years, how many miles I'm putting in on a weekly basis. And I really think that in a sport that's so endurance focused, especially if you're going for the half marathon, marathon, but evidently even, for something like the 5K, I think for the majority of runners, you can definitely get a lot of improvement just by improving the extent to which you adhere to your schedule, which is going to be a combination of experimenting with what works for you and following some tried and true training principles like building up mileage slowly and trying to maintain a large base for just about as long as you can.
Yeah. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.